Yes, sir. This is Theology in the Dirt. We're trying to practice our theology in the public square of our homes, our city, and our world. You get sermon notes, links to the rest of the podcast at theologyinthedirt.com. My name is Mitchell Jolly.
And I'm Chris Hayes.
John Palmer.
Dude, appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
You ready to shake and bake?
Let's do it.
Shake and bake.
Shake and bake. Shake and then bake. Shake and bake.
Shake and bake.
It's shake and bake time. Shake and bake, buddy. Shake it before you bake it.
Why does that make me laugh every time I hear it?
Because it's
That's why we keep playing it.
It's the apex of human comedy.
I know it's coming.
It's so good, man. The movie's
funny, man.
Absolutely incredible. Well, hey, guys, we appreciate you watching, listening to Theology in the Dirt. And our new regular, John Palmer, is back with us. And incredible dynamic of having John with us on the podcast. So you can see him, and you're going to be seeing John regularly on the podcast. Makes for great discussion. One of the things I love about doing Theology in the Dirt is I feel like we get better and better each week that we record a podcast, and our dynamic grows as we discuss things. That's one of the avenues we have as leaders in a local church to be able to provide content for our people to learn from as we try to talk through stuff. So today we want to talk about a topic that I think is super important for us because I think it's a little bit of a mystery. It's one of those things we quote, we say to each other, is I got to take that thought captive. You got to take that thought captive. And how? How am I supposed to take that thought captive? I have a little cage and I just and catch it. And so we want to talk about taking thoughts captive and making them obey Christ today. Because we talked about the neurocycle. We talked about capturing, being attuned to what's going on in our souls. And we spoke about at length. We talk about the neurocycle, the fact that this stuff's in the Bible. It's not like this is not in the text of Scripture. Yeah. But some of it requires us to take the text and read it and make sense of it. And so that's what we want to do today with a passage. So it's 2 Corinthians 10, and it is not just 1 to 5. The complete thought finishes in verse 6. And here's what Paul, the old apostle, says to a very contentious church. They didn't have a great relationship. When you read Paul in the church at Corinth, when he's writing to them, they had some critique of him, and he had some critique of them, and some of them didn't like him, and he struggled with the church at Corinth. And you pick some of that up here at the beginning of this section. He said, I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I'm away. So that's a critique, right? When you're here, you're all Mr. Sweet and nice, but when you're away, you write these rough letters to us. He said, I beg of you that when I'm present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. So it seems like some have critiqued the apostles, Paul particularly, of living in the flesh. And so he says, when I'm with you, I'm going to have to address that. All right, so I'm going to have to address that, and I will show boldness if I have to, but I prefer to be meek. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh, right? So my having to be bold with you in correcting some of these false ideas is not a fleshly fight. Verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. So the weapons we do use are divine, and they have power to destroy strongholds. Well, what are the strongholds? He answers in verse 5, we destroy arguments like the ones they're making, that you're meek, then you're bold, and you're making these weighty statements. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Wow. That's a lot, right? And so it is like taking thoughts captive, but what are we taking captive? Why are the thoughts there? And what are we combating? In Paul's language is a divine warfare. There's a warfare going on of thoughts and ideas and strongholds, and those strongholds are ideas set against the knowledge of God. And so he's saying this to a church who's accusing him of some things, and he is combating those ideas with the divine warfare of taking thoughts captive to make them obey Jesus, so that if he has to punish disobedience, he does so when their obedience is complete. So that's a lot to unpack. But if we're talking about taking thoughts captive, it's not just mine. It is my individual work but it's also in the setting of fellowship inside a local church and dealing with ideas that are contrary to truly what it is to know God. So if we're going to deal with our emotional, mental well-being as a fellowship and as individuals, we have to make sense of what it means to take thoughts captive and make them obey Jesus. So word vomit out on the table. What do we do with that? What is taking thoughts captive to make them obey Christ?
Yeah, well, to start for me, growing up, I always heard this passage, but it was always presented as he's telling us to take our own thoughts captive, which I think is part of that, but realizing that it wasn't until not long ago. You never taught that, so just to declare, I never heard that Three Rivers, but It was always presented as like there was a period there, and then take every thought captive.
Right.
And so for me, it was like looking, okay, well, let me look at it from what he's saying first. And he's just, they got these boastful, like philosophical guys, and he's trying to take them down a notch, basically. He's crushing their worldview, taking their thoughts captive so that to help bring about obedience. The goal that they would become right thinkers, obedient in the way of Christ. So if that was his goal and doing that for them, I look at it for me as, okay, so the purpose of that is to make me a right thinker, is to help align my thinking and my mind with the biblical worldview, not a worldly worldview. And so, but just the phrase of taking it captive really sticks out to me. It's not as simple as like protect your mind or just change your mind. It's like take them captive, which is an aggressive, active component of this that if almost in a way, if this doesn't happen, then you're going to spiral down a way that's going to be much harder to come back from. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I look at it, there's a very, number one, Paul's very serious in his tone. And I think that's important for us to take from that is like, no, this is very, very serious. Take captive those thoughts, because if you start swaying away from obedience and from understanding what the scripture is saying, you're headed down the wrong path, and it's going to be really difficult to come back. Yeah. And I think we've probably all experienced that in some ways. And so, yeah, you really do have to take it captive. You have to attack that and get back on par. And sometimes we need help with that. It's not sometimes we get to a place where we can't take them captive. Yeah, because we don't have control.
It's interesting that I've just had this thought come to mind. The language of taking captive. 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul's telling him the Lord's servant doesn't need to be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. So that's not the first time Paul's used this language of capture. And so taking captive, there are people who've been taken captive, and our task is then to capture some things. So that language is active and powerful. Some have been captured, and clearly in the 2 Corinthians passage, they've been captured with a thought that's set up against knowledge of God. And he says here that that's happened because the devil's captured them. And so our task is to take the thoughts that they have propagated and capture them and flip them back around so that they are obeying Christ. Yeah. And that's active. That's powerful.
Yeah. Satan is the ultimate deceiver. Right. So when you talk about the deception, there's like what's coming to my mind, like the question is, well, how do I know which thought is bad and that I need to take captive? And the only way you know that is to know the truth, right? And it's to read and to understand and to constantly seek the Lord, because if not, you don't know what thought is a wrong thought to have in order to capture it, right?
Right.
That was my first thought, but that initially, whenever you had sent that what the topic was going to be today, there's one thing that came to my mind, and I feel like I lean more into like what foundationally, like what is that? How do I do that? Like what causes that thought that I have that I need to capture? And the scripture verse from Matthew 6, I think it was Matthew 6, it's Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was talking. Now he was referencing this with wealth, but he says the eye is the lamp of the whole body. So if what I see is going to direct me in my thoughts, and so the first thing that I thought about, how do I combat the bad thoughts that I need to capture is be careful what my eye sees, because my eyes are going to direct my entire body, what Jesus says. Now, he's talking about wealth there, So I know he's talking more about greed and that type of thing. But if my eyes are set on things that are of the world, then that creates that greed. So it's it directs the whole body. So even no matter what we're talking about watching the YouTubes. And I put an S on the end of that because I'm an old man.
Because you just got home from the Kroger's.
Yeah, right, and Walmart's.
And the Walmart's.
But I mean, if you're watching those things, you're watching what's on TV. We talked about this a couple podcasts ago. It's like, man, that stuff sits in your mentals, you know?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Remember that old like Sunday school song, like, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see, little ears, what you hear, because the Father up above is looking down in love." I don't know, that just popped in my head because I'm like, we learned that at such a young age.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always become easier. I think, if anything, it becomes more difficult as you get older, because when you're younger, you can be shielded some of that by parents and stuff. When you get older, and now it's just stuff is everywhere, just junk everywhere, lies everywhere, just so much coming at you from so many different directions. I say that because that's just a great point. It starts with our eye, what we see, what we hear. That's the entryway into the mind.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, that's
Jesus says it directs our entire body.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does. And that, getting down in the weeds of that is what we take in, and we're always taking information in. Even in the non-technologically driven day, we were taking data in. And I found myself in thinking about this as a kid. Like, I didn't have the kind of technology we have now. It was play outside, interact with friends in the neighborhood, whatever happened to be going on. I actually I love the sports section of the newspaper, funnies, the comics, all that stuff, whatever friends had. But I remember having to deal with thoughts. Like, where did that thought come from? And it made me start thinking, if we're talking about taking thoughts captive corporately, dealing with things that stand against knowledge of God, the question is, where do those thoughts come from? What's fueling them? It's like your eyes, what we're taking in, information we're hearing, experiences that happen to us, create an inner life that often is unspoken.
Yeah.
Because we don't always articulate everything that's going on, and nor should we be. We have filters, right? We learn not to say certain things. But this type of taking thoughts captive is having to manage this inner life that's been affected by what's coming in. Constant input, and it's data. And we're assimilating it, and it affects what happens in our brain to our body.
Yeah.
And so this idea of taking thoughts captive is really becoming aware of the inner life, finding out what's there, how it got there, and what in the heck am I supposed to do with it now? Because it's there. Crazy thing about our brains is, man, it's the world's fastest, most incredible supercomputer. We only use a small portion of it.
Yeah.
And this information, the eye is the lamp of the body, right? And then, man, when the Lord said, and if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness?
Yeah, dude.
Right?
Unbelievable. And so, and that gives Satan the playground. So going back to exactly what we're talking about, the deceiver putting those thoughts in, you gave him a playground.
Yeah.
Because now you're looking at things that's now giving him the opportunity to start playing with those thoughts. Yeah. And so I had a friend of mine, you're sitting there talking about, I was like, I have a friend of mine at the steel mill. The name's Dave. If you ever get a chance to meet Dave at the steel mill, you need to meet him. He's an awesome dude. But he used to tell me every time I went to the beach and I was a single man, he was like, hey, make a covenant with your feet. I was like, what are you talking about? He said, keep your eyes down. Don't look around. Awesome. So he said, hey, did you make a covenant with your feet? And really what he's saying is like, you go to the beach, man, you like, there's things there that, you got to be careful, right? Yeah. What you're looking at.
That's right.
Because then it's thoughts. And that's the easy way that it kind of works its way in. Elena and I talk about that a lot, is like, that's the boiling of the frog thing. Like, it doesn't seem that big a deal at the time.
Right.
But a little bit of that goes and it just builds upon itself. And the next thing you know, with everything that we have access to, like Chris, what you're saying, man, you're in a hole in a freaking heartbeat.
Yeah.
Well, and I find, and y'all are older than me, just so we're clear. But as I get older, but I find that as I get older, get a little bit more wise, just a little bit. In those times where my thoughts are captive and I'm walking in obedience, the less I want any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that resonates with y'all too. Like, it just feels like there's a beautiful result. It's the same thing as if you were a drug addict, right? And you've finally gotten away from that. Like, you want it less because you see the beauty of the result when you are not controlled by that. Yeah. Right. And I feel like the captive or taking captive our thoughts works in a similar way. When we do that well, and that produces obedience, and it produces us aligning biblically, we're we don't want it, and we're more aware of what's coming in and out as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here's a question. I want to ask this, my curious question. What are the sources of those thoughts? Where do they come from? So one of the first things that come to mind is it may be images from where we happen to be physically located. What about also supernatural forces, right? Because you can be in church worshiping, and an intrusive thought happen. It don't have to be like, it can just be an untrue thought. Like, is God really hearing what I'm saying? Like, I mean, have you ever been in worship and actually had the doubt creep in? Like, is this real?
Yeah.
Like, where did I wasn't reading a magazine article, wouldn't listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
I'm singing a song and the thought pops into my mind that goes, is this really just a game?
Yeah.
Or is it real?
I think it's 100% real.
Right.
And I think it's 100% stinking warfare up in the head, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no doubt. I mean, I know exactly what you're saying. I can't tell you how many times I've been like, I can't believe I just thought about that just then.
Yeah.
It's like, what in the world is wrong with me? And then it's like, man, Lord, help me with that. Like that,
Yeah.
I don't know. That, man,
Yeah.
I'm telling you, that's a crazy.
Because if we're going to take it captive, we got to figure out where's it coming from.
Yeah, right.
No, I was gonna say, I think that's Satan's number one target in anybody. It's the mind. It's just, and it's not usually big things. Like, it's not just like this gigantic meteor hitting you. It's just that tiny little doubt. Maybe it's a tiny little fear. It's that, are those people talking about me? Or it's, man, I wish I was that's more spiritual like that. It could be something like that. It could be, is all this real? Is it really real? Is he really listening? It's just the smallest thing. Mm-hmm. But then it's so hard to not, well, let me just go a little farther down the rabbit hole. And then he gets that foothold. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden because and this is going to be a weird sidetrack, I'll keep it short, but like, we talked about school shootings recently. And if you listen to a lot of the guys who've committed school shootings that survived and talk about it later, almost all of them started with one little thought.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it was one little thought that kind of manifested, and then because they were a lot of times they're loners and they're in isolation, which I'm going to come back to later. But but I think that's a big piece too. That's why we are not created to live that way.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's why community and discipleship and stuff is so crucial, because that one little thought becomes a million little thoughts, and then that becomes a billion big thoughts when you're in isolation, and you don't have anyone to talk with about it.
Another source might be human interaction that lead to experiences between humans that get you distracted. So you might have an interaction with someone that maybe dysregulated you, made you angry, made you sad, got you distracted, and caused you in that dysregulated state to get into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, fib, whatever's going on. And then now all of a sudden you got these thoughts about what happened in that relationship. Why did that happen? Why did that get said? Why did I respond that way? Now you're completely distracted. Mm-hmm. And so a source of thoughts that need to be taken captive could be negative human interaction, right? So I have a bad interaction with another human being, and now I'm in this space of going, what am I supposed to do with that? Because when you're in that dysregulated trauma state, we are not seeing, hearing, understanding everything that's going on correctly. Mm-hmm. And so that's a source, a negative human interaction that's distracting or dysregulating. And when people hear, I don't know that I've used that word a lot on the podcast, dysregulated, what we mean by that is you're out of your thinking brain into your surviving brain, and you're not thinking, you're surviving. And in the survival mode is not the time. It's not the time to be making big decisions.
Yeah.
Right, and so that may be a source of thoughts, negative human interaction. Yeah. What else?
Because take captive means to get control of, and the only reason you would need to get control of something is if you don't have control.
Yeah,
and that's really what it's about. It's you've lost control of those thoughts, and you need to take it captive, or you need someone else to take it. Because to me, I think, and I hope I'm not maybe transitioning into something you're going to hear, but
that's fine.
Seems like there's a lot of ample applications for leadership here, particularly church leadership.
Sure.
So if that's okay, I got a question for you guys.
Yeah.
That just that came up as I was thinking through this, because, and you know how I like to ask questions and then give you a little information and then come back to it. So forgive me, John, if you're new to that.
That's okay.
Because I want to kind of set it up why I'm asking that. So the question is, even if, assuming that assuming that leaders hold some responsibility in the church, pastors or disciple leaders or some whatever church leaders in general have some responsibility to help take the thoughts captive of others. And I think Paul's giving an example of that as their spiritual father. Then, like, how do we as leaders get people to do this? Like, how do you get people to submit themselves to God and say, Lord, let your word dismantle me? And it comes from, 2 Timothy 3:16, right? We know all scripture is breathed out by God, profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. Sometimes those parts of reproof and correction completely wreck us. And we need that, right? When we're disciplined, sometimes the Lord disciplines us children. He prunes us. He molds us. It's uncomfortable. It's a painful process. And so I guess the question is, how much responsibility is that on you guys as leaders? Because at some point, you can't carry all the weight. But also, people have to want that too, right? Like, it's not so simple as... and I hope that makes sense. I don't know if but it just, even if they don't know the cost of that, at some point they have to say, I really want this, but I'm incapable of that.
Well, I think the very first thing is that they're gonna look at us as an example. So if we're not doing it, how we expect them to do it, 100%. Right? So I think that it does rely more on our actions than our words. Yes, we definitely want to lean into those conversations and have people talk through those things with us, but I think unless they see us doing it, then what gives them the comfort level that they're going to approach us to do it? And so I think we have to make sure that our actions are being in alignment, so that when, I say all the time, like you can't expect to call yourself a leader if you turn around and nobody's following you. So it has a lot to do with our actions. And so what are we doing? I mean, I ask myself that question a lot, is like, am I doing, and they're able to see in me what I think that they should be doing. And if I can't answer that question, then I need to look back and work on me, and then the Lord will take care of all the other stuff in my leadership.
I think the flip side of that then would be, if you're not doing that, you may not even see that other people need that. Yeah. Because attunement in your own life creates awareness of others.
Yeah, there's a level of I hate using the word. I mean, we've hijacked the word intimacy, but there's a level of intimacy that scares the crap out of me. Mm-hmm. Like, I just don't like it. Sure. But I know from a leadership and leading in a vulnerable position, that's what makes people follow. Because they want to know that they're not alone in the thoughts that they're having. They want to know that leadership is like, man, am I stinking nut job that I just had that thought when I'm sitting here worshiping? Do I think that they have that? And we have to show that we're exactly the same. We're in the same boat. Yeah. And honestly, if you call yourself a Christian and you're following Jesus, you're literally the only difference between us and the being an eldership, you have a natural or a noble desire. Right. It's like all the qualifications apply. So I think it's like, man, it's I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, but I think you know what I'm saying.
Remind me, hit me with the question again.
So the question,
I want to understand exactly what you're asking.
It's kind of twofold. It's, what responsibility is there on pastors and on leaders to, at times, take thoughts captive of the people that you're leading, whether that's the congregation or it may just be a small number that you're discipling, because I know you can't do everybody. And then how much of that is their willingness and to do that? Because if not, then how can you accomplish that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I would say it is our primary task is taking thoughts captive corporately by how we lead and how we teach. I think that is the work, which is why James is very clear that don't take that mantle on you too soon, because you're going to have a stricter judgment before the Lord. And grace and mercy, that Corinthians passage where hey, everything's going to have to pass through the flame of the gaze of the holy God. And what gets burned up, it's going to be lost, but you yourself will be saved as one escaping through the flames. But whatever survives that gaze, man, good, right? Mm-hmm. So don't presume to be any person in that role of elder, overseer, whose job is to teach, because I'm going to have to stand before the Lord and give account for what I say. So I would say our task is this. This is why Paul, I think, spent so much time writing letters. Is he's commented, even he said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, 1-5, he said, man, we had to leave you guys. We didn't get to finish the task. And so I had to send back to you to find out about your faith for fear somehow that the tempter had tempted you and our labor would be in vain. He was writing letters to continue the instruction because this was at stake. And so he wrote letters, he made visits. Like we know 3 missionary journeys. We also know there was more. I mean, his task was to get to Corinth, get to Ephesus, get to Philippi. And when he couldn't be there, he was writing letters and sending them by his faithful companions. So I would say, yes, that is our task, is to corporately take thoughts captive, because we can testify to our meetings that we're constantly taking thoughts captive. There's always somebody saying X, Y, Z, and we're going, well, is that true? We were talking about one today. That's a thought that needs to be taken captive, because somebody perceives this from this person, and we don't even know what that person meant by that, but it's affecting the joy of this person, and we're going, that's our task, to take that captive and turn that around and make that obey Jesus. So I would say 100% of our work is constantly taking corporate thoughts captive, which is like on Church Sunday, the 4th Sunday in January. It's taking the thought captive of, well, how does the church use the money, and where are we going, and what are we doing? We take that captive by going, here's all the 2,700 line item pages. Here's how much money we have. Here's how we spend it. Here's what we do with it. Here's what all the stuff is. And this is where it's going this year, so that you take captive that thought that says, well, they're just. Well, there's no room for theirs just, because you're just like, well, here
That's
it is.
a really cool way of looking at it, dude. I never even thought about the way you're framing it right now. That's
So that's why I was trying to catch the spirit. I understand the question. I think that is constantly our task, because then that's just the corporate task. Then there's the theological task of, people walk in on Sunday. Like I even do this. Like I was super distracted Sunday, just dealing with something in the back of my mind relationally, and I could barely focus on the moment. And I think, well, that's me. Who else? Because we have those Sundays where you get that feel, the vibes off, and you don't exactly know why, but you got to stand up there and preach to people. And you're like, I feel like I should address this, but I feel like that's weird. So should I do that? So there's this constant struggle of going, what needs to be taken captive in this moment or spoken to? Because who's struggling right now? Who can't focus because they had an argument with their wife on the way in, or yelled at their kid unnecessarily, or whatever the case may be. They're here out of sheer will, but they don't want to be here. And so there's this constant, because everything that's happening is fueled by some thought, right? There's no such thing as non-thought. We're always thinking. And it either fuels us in a direction of the Lord or away from the Lord. And it's the Isaiah passage, you keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. So it's us helping people get to that place that their minds are stayed on the Lord, so that they can be in a state of peace before God and man. And I would say 100% of our task is taking those thoughts captive to help us and them be there.
What is that? So let me ask this question. Like, there's a question upon that, but when we think about the thoughts that we're talking about taking captive, it's usually the negative context, really.
Right.
But taking the thought that's actually good, because there's no neutral thought.
No,
right?
no.
It's either of the light or of the darkness.
100%. Yeah.
And so
I think that's I agree with you, and I think some people would ask the question, is that true?
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
There's no neutral thoughts.
Right. And so how do you take that thought from the light? Because the Lord speaks the same.
Right.
It's not all just bad and negative. It's
sometimes it's bad wrapped in good.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the discernment piece comes in, because part of our task in taking thoughts captive is guarding against false teaching. Because, if false teaching were so evident, people wouldn't believe it. So it's wrapped nicely and this beautiful saying and this beautiful idea with a culturally right, with a silver-tongued prophet who can sell you with a smile on this thing, and it's like, oh, that must be true because it made me feel good.
Yeah.
It might be. What if it's not? Yeah. And so it's that ability to discern and guard against false teaching and say, no, there are no neutral thoughts. It either takes you to the Lord or away from the Lord. And if it's untrue and you thought it took you to the Lord, then that's really a nefarious evil cancer.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to discern those things and take those captive and flip them around to make them obey Christ.
Yeah. And we have to, and so going back to your point about leadership too is, and I think this was an earlier thing, is where you're going with not being in isolation. We constantly have to teach that we should not be in isolation.
Right.
Like we have to be talking about these things with each other, because I can take a thought that I think is truth and be like, man, is that really truth? And how do I bounce that off of somebody else?
Yeah.
If I try to bounce that off myself, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to speak lies to myself.
Yeah.
I'm not even too sure.
You have to have somebody to bounce it off of, and you have to have one person at least fully regulated and thinking.
Yeah.
If you have two dysregulated people trying to take thoughts captive, you're just deceiving each other, and you're feeding down the spiral of mutual dysregulation.
This is how fights happen.
It's how fights happen.
Yeah.
It's how husbands and wives get in fights. How friends get in fights is you just two pissed off people.
Yeah.
And you just start swirling down the thing, and you swear you're telling the truth.
Yeah.
I'm telling the truth. And you're like, well, I'm telling the truth too. Well, truth you. And the next thing you know, you're like, and it's like, wait a second.
Have you ever said that to Jim? Truth you?
No, I've said worse.
This is my truth. I hate that when people say that.
Yeah.
But
No. Yeah. No,
Cool.
but you have to have, in the fellowship, then there have to be, somebody's got to be regulated and thinking and listening to the Spirit and able to not be emotionally whipped around by the emotional whipping.
Yeah.
Because that's what living by emotive impulses do. Is it's like James says, it's a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. And at some point you have to be around somebody that's got a foot in the ground, fully regulated, thinking on the truth and not moved by my emotive moment. Does that make sense? Otherwise, man, you're in deep poo-poo.
Yeah.
That's bad.
And really, I think what we're talking about hits at the whole heart and the reason why we do this, because certainly preaching is a way to help keep minds captive for people on the right things. But there's only so much you can do in 30, 40, 60 minutes, of preaching. And I think following that up too, though, would that also not mean that the equipping piece is just as much important as the preaching? Because you've also got to equip people how to go and discern truth for themselves, knowing that, you might be up there preaching with some crazy thoughts going on and be like, hey, I'm preaching what is true, but it's also important that you go learn how to read and interpret scriptures and test these things with what you know about the Lord as well. Mm-hmm. I know you talk about that a lot. It's like, no, don't just take my word for it. It's not because you're lying or that you don't trust what you're saying, but there has to be a proponent too where people can go and take that and use that and apply it in another way. And I think by providing a podcast where we can talk about things that don't fit into the scope of a 30-minute sermon every week, providing other opportunities for people that today we call it content creation, but really it's providing just additional ways for them to keep their mind straight and to think about the same things that we know that they're already thinking on. Yeah. And here's some practical ways to do that.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely huge. We have to do that. And I want us to a minute get to a very specific example, because we were talking about it at our meeting before we recorded, and I think it's a good example because people can say, give me an example of how to take a thought captive. And I want to get to that. But I think one of the ways we're gonna have to really address taking thoughts captive is address our biblical content, and then we talk about addressing biblical content. Then we've got to get down into the application of that in the tactics. And here's an example of what I mean. Some of the examples of taking thoughts captive is we may have a group, because it's in large group preaching, podcast, but sometimes small group discipleship. You have a discipleship relationship. Well, in that, some of the examples, I'm trying to not get too specific because I'm not trying to out anybody or I don't want to hate on anybody. But there's this component of I am in agreement with everything, but there's this one thing I'm not in agreement on. And so what I want to do is that one thing I'm not in agreement on, I want to treat it as though it's okay. And I'm going to teach other things, that thing I'm not in agreement on, but I want to stay tight with you. Like I want to be contrary to you, but I want to stay tight with you. And being contrary to you and staying tight with you is still unity. All right? And so what I would say is no, being contrary and staying in unity are mutually exclusive. And so taking that thought captive would look like, no, hey, brother, actually what you're doing is fighting against. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You can't believe that and teach that and still be in unity here and not fighting against your leadership. And so what I've got to do is take that thought captive and go, what you believe there is not wrong. It's not evil. It doesn't fit within the framework of who we are denominationally or ethically in regard to how you approach leadership. So to take that thought captive looks like it's probably better for you if you go over here, and it's okay if you go over there. That's not sin. It's not wrong, but it's better for you to be over there. Because if you try to stay here and teach opposite of what we're teaching, you're actually bringing and inserting disunity. And so the thought you're taking captive is this idea that I can be contrary and we can still be in unity. You can't be contrary and be in unity. That's something's in the flesh there. We can agree that it's okay to disagree on that, but we're probably not going to worship together. And that's not evil. But it's taking captive this idea that I can be contrary to my leadership and still be in unity. And you should just be okay with that.
Yeah.
As opposed to going, no, actually, this is why we do a membership class. This is why we teach you what we believe and teach so that you know how to be in line with us. And if not, it's okay to go somewhere else.
Yeah, let me ask you a follow-up question to that, because I think I know where you're going or where you're trying to.
I'm trying to be very vague.
Yeah, no, I know.
But give an example if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And because my mind was still on, I was trying to think of like contrary to what?
Right.
Like, so contrary to how we teach in certain doctrine that we have at our church, yes.
Yep.
Contrary of, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, no.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So,
correct.
So there is a difference there in what you're talking about, contrary versus agreement.
That's right.
Because you can still have unity and be a Republican and a Democrat.
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, it depends.
Oh, yeah, that's arguable.
Not right now. It's
arguable.
That's arguable. I mean, okay, I get that. But I know exactly what you're saying in that and capturing that.
Because what ends up happening is we can inject disunity in the name of unity while being contrary to people I'm supposed to be submitted to.
Yeah.
Because maybe you can get all the reasons why somebody may want to do that. It may be they want to pull people down a trail. It may be that they're just young and don't understand the dynamics of being in unity in a fellowship as a member of a local church. It could be because church membership isn't emphasized and hasn't been emphasized for people. Yeah. And so there's 100 reasons why that might happen. But part of taking thoughts captive is this idea, this specific idea of I can be in unity while being contrary, and everybody's supposed to be okay with it.
Yeah.
And what you got to do is take that captive and go, no, unity equals unity, and it has to be very specific on, there are some things we can be in disunity on. Falcons, Saints, I ain't going to like you if you're a Saints fan.
Yeah.
But we can still go to church together, right? And so, silly example, but you have to be able to outline what's immovable, what's debatable and negotiable, and what's not. And if it's some of those things that are just immovable and you're trying to be contrary, we got to take that idea captive and go, no, this is okay. And you preserve unity by being clear. Clear is kind. And this is an immovable object. This is an immovable truth. We're not going to move on this. And so therefore, being contrary is not unifying, and your thought is contrary to truth. And it's contrary to tactical truth, revealed natural law. You can't be contrary and be in unity at the same time. So the solution is agree or move on. Both are fine.
I think there's another component to that in some instances, though, where there's this, and I think this happens a lot in marriage and ruins a lot of marriages, where you go into it knowing that you're not on that same way. We talk about being equally yoked.
Yeah.
And it may be as simple as like, well, you want kids and I don't want kids, but one of you is thinking, I can convince them or they're going to change. And I wonder if sometimes that same thing happens in those relationships where it's like, yeah, we can coexist, we're unified. But one of those people a lot of times is thinking, I can convince them. Or in time, they're going to come around, which is disunifying from the get-go, but we kind of, cover it up with some nice, pretty words of unity and stuff like that, all the while it becomes a pride issue. And so I think that there's a proponent of that a lot of times that is, it may not even be known.
And in that instance, the thought to take captive is the idea that we can be in disagreement and I can convince them. That's the thought that has to
Right.
be taken captive, is that no, that's needs to be settled on the front end.
Yeah.
I can think of 3 specific couples of which I did their premarital counseling, of which there was a major issue like that, and my counsel to them is do not get married till you settled that. And in all 3 instances, one thought they could convince the other, and the other was because they were so in love, couldn't wait to have sex, that they just decided to get married anyway, and it wrecked all 3 marriages. And so one of those, the thought to take captive is that I can convince them of this place that is going to wreck our marriage in 5 years. Because we're just so in love, and it's just because love rules
come
the
around.
day. They're going to come
Yeah.
around because I know I'm right, and I can just bear with their little wrong for a little bit. And next thing you know, marriage wrecked. And the thought to take captive is we're in disagreement, and I can convince them.
Yeah.
That you got to take that captive and say, no, how we make that obey Christ is we've got to figure out unity, or we're going to have to go our separate ways before we wreck something farther down the road. As painful as that is, that's the activity of taking a thought captive before we get really into some hard things, you know? And so, again, that's identifying the thought. And then, okay, but what's interesting is I would argue that idea of I can convince you is an evil thought.
Yeah.
If you're depending on the setting.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, man, I'm sitting here and my head's kind of reeling a little bit.
Right. Because there's no neutral thoughts.
Yeah.
And this idea of like, we're going to get married and be in complete disagreement is contrary to Genesis 2. Because he took her out of his side and put her beside him and made them one flesh. And if you're going in already 2 different fleshes, the enemy's trying to convince you that you can make 2 fleshes one flesh.
Yeah.
And you got to take that, because that's an evil thought.
Yeah.
And baptizing it in the name of Christian marriage. And for me, and this as an elder who performs weddings, my task is to identify that and refuse to put my name and the name of our church and the name of Jesus on that. And so that's an example of taking a thought captive, because as beautiful as love, man, love is patient, kind, keeps no record. Yeah, then we're good. It's just starstruck and in love. I'm like, no, we have an evil thing right here, and if we don't recognize it, it's going to wreck your marriage. No, it's not going to wreck us. We love each other too much. Marriage wrecked. And so that's an example of how nefarious thoughts can be.
Yeah.
And
Which
baptize
I think
them.
that's a pretty good parallel there between that and church membership.
Yeah,
I mean, because you're entering into a covenant.
you are. That's right.
I mean, when you get a membership, you're signing a covenant.
That's right.
And so you're agreeing to certain things within the covenant of membership. Same thing with marriage. You're agreeing.
Right.
And the same
To
thing,
certain
there's tier 1 non-negotiables, and there's tier 2 and 3.
That's right.
But sometimes one of the people is thinking a tier 1 as a tier 3 or vice versa.
Yeah.
And if you get that wrong, that's when all those problems come.
And I think even on that subject of captivating thoughts and in our own church framework, I mean, just in what we teach in KDSC is a lot of capturing thoughts.
It is.
Because of our
Yeah.
culture of teaching church framework, and then you flip that into kingdom framework, and it, man, like, I know what it was for me, like didn't understand kingdom framework at all.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, wait, all those thoughts that I have, I got to captivate those. I got to capture those, and now I got to do something with them.
Got to make them obey Christ.
Yeah.
That's that key shift of needs versus assets. That's a place thoughts get taken captive.
Yeah.
Like the church framework comes in and says, I have needs and it's your job to meet them.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come and consume till I meet some kind of need.
And that feels right.
Feels right.
People come in, it feels right. They're like, where is all these things that I can get involved in with this church? And we're like, they're just not here.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're like, well, wait, there's total confusion there,
Yeah.
right? So there's some.
Yeah. And you take that captive and say, no, you actually have been gifted by the Spirit of God, by the resurrected Christ, to be a member of the body for mission.
Yeah.
What is the asset you bring to the table, and how can we employ it on mission tomorrow in your vocation? That's a process of taking captive thoughts.
Yes.
Right?
But that's how the rest of the world works, though. It's like, if I'm sick, I go to a doctor, and they give me things that I need to fix something. Mm-hmm. If I'm hungry, I go to the restaurant. They make the food that I need to restore. And so everything else we do is in the world is that framework. That's why it's so comfortable. And then coming here and flipping that around is difficult for a lot of people. And I think that's why so many churches either refuse to switch, or they have never had any idea that what they were doing
Right.
was not kingdom.
What Paul was addressing there with Corinth is the fact that he is trying to get them to see and savor the exclusivity of Jesus. You go back to chapter 1 and 2, and Jews want wisdom, Greeks want wisdom, Jews want knowledge, but we preach Christ crucified. So when I was among you, I determined to know nothing except Jesus and him crucified. And they're like, well, what about my mother-in-law I'm having sex with? And what about these temples and these food sacrificed idols and all this stuff? And no, Jesus alone, Jesus alone. Oh, he who is meek with us and gentle, but when he writes away, he writes these tough letters. And so Paul's having like, no, guys, we got to get this back down to these basic issues of discipleship and get you moving in the right direction. And so he was dealing with all kinds of thoughts he had to bring captive and make obey Christ. And so part of that is there's an individual, as individuals, we're taking information, we're processing thoughts, then we bring it to the corporate. And I mean, that's a sneaky dynamic.
Yeah.
And so I think it requires us to be super aware that this is probably our all the time job and discerning that stuff out. We're really totally running out of time. And so we need to draw it to a close. I didn't get to the example I wanted to give because we're going to run out of time. You got to get somewhere. We got lots to do, but give us some final thoughts. John, give us some thoughts. Chris, give us some thoughts, and then we'll do Hayes takeaways and get us.
My final thoughts will be my takeaways.
Okay,
so y'all go ahead.
Let's do it. What are your final thoughts, John, as we try to process this out a little bit?
Man, I think the only thing I kept thinking about, we're sitting here going back and forth 100 times, is I'm just thankful for Jesus' grace. And just thankful for that. Golly, because we're trying to figure this stuff out. It's hard.
It is hard.
And you've seen us. We're sitting here within 45 minutes, batting back and forth 100 times, and it's like, we're going to keep fighting, but man, thankful for Jesus' grace.
Yeah. Well, I think this is how you take thoughts captive. You have to get this stuff out there, get in the grains, and deal with it. I want to leave with this thought. Bibliocentric, we got to have the scriptures downloaded. The scriptures have to inform our thinking so that there's a comparison and contrast factor there. So when things come in that don't match the truth of God, I can start to recognize, hey, that don't line up.
Yeah.
One of the examples that have really, we talked about this earlier today, as the idea that things are just always supposed to work out for us. And when they don't, there's a conflict in us because we say what the psalmist said in Psalm 73, all in vain I've kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. It's been vain for me to be holy because nothing has worked out. I keep getting kicked in the teeth. God, where are you? You're not just. If you love me, it's no way this could be happening. How effective is the cross when I can't stinking win?
Yeah.
All in vain I've kept my heart clean and washed my hand in innocence. So screw it. I'm done. I don't want any more of this. I don't want any more holiness because that fool over there keeps doing wrong, and it goes right. What's the good? Right? And dude, I'm telling you, if anybody listening to this hadn't been there, it's coming. And if you're in the middle of it, I want to finish the psalm.
Yeah, without crying.
Yeah, without crying. For all day long, I've been stricken and rebuked every morning. If I had said, I will speak thus, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to be a wearisome task. Oh, yeah. Until I went to the sanctuary of God, and then I discerned their end. Truly, you set them in slippery places. You make them fall to ruin. How they're destroyed in a moment, swept away utterly by terrors. And then he goes on to describe his state when all this was going on. My soul was embittered when I was pricked in heart, and I was brutish and ignorant, and I was like a beast towards you. But nevertheless, I'm continually with you, and you hold my right hand. You will guide me with your counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. Whom I in heaven but you? And so, man, that's what the psalmist is doing there in Psalm 73 is taking the thought captive. It was worthless for me to be holy. That's a thought. And he goes, wait a second. Let me just finish the thought out. Here's what I was thinking. Here's how I was feeling. But then I came to worship and I saw you and I realized, oh man, just hang on.
Yeah.
Hang on. Because I saw their end. It's coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 5 years. But don't throw away eternal righteousness for the sake of a temporary gain. That's taking that thought captive. No, it wasn't vain to be holy. It's never vain to be holy, but it may feel like it. So you take that captive and say, no, I know their end. It's coming. And so I will stay the course. That's an example of me taking the thought captive and using the scriptures to do so.
That's good, man.
I lied. I do have one final thought before I take away, because it just, what you guys are saying just spurred me to this thought. I wonder if the reason that the Lord talks so much about giving us rest and sustaining us and, casting our cares on him is because to do this well is exhausting.
Yeah, it's tiring.
It's constant and it wears us out.
Yeah.
And so we need that we need his grace. We need that reminder that he carries that for us because it leads us to obedience. And we need that reminder that just as the sun will rise tomorrow, his mercies are new. And I think that's important because
There's a lot more to talk about. This is going to be a part 2.
I think we might need a part 2.
Yeah.
Get us to some takeaways, and we're going to have, there's part 2.
Yeah.
Man, I poured all into these takeaways. These are some powerhouse takeaways today.
Part 2, baby. We're going.
All right, here we'll go through them, though. It's important. All right, number 1, God will transform you, but only after the renewing of your mind. We learned that Romans 12:2, a verse we commonly quote on Theology in the Dirt. And the way we have our mind renewed is by no longer conforming to the world, which is to set our mind on Christ. We're so easily distracted that we often need blinders like they put on horses. That helps the horse from getting spooked, but it also limits their field of vision to help them look and focus only on where they're being led to go. Likewise, keeping our mind on Christ and taking our thoughts captive keeps us focused on where he is leading us, and that will transform us. Number 2, how do we do number 1? Well, Paul tells us that in Philippians 4:4-8. So rejoice in the Lord always, and he gets to the part where he says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think on these things. Number 3, the root of a lot of mental health issues is our inability to control our thoughts. When we don't have control, it opens the way for fear, anxiety, sadness, uncertainty, stress, and much more. And Satan thrives in those situations, and that's why it becomes a cycle, and eventually it's like quicksand, slowly sinking us into a deeper state. And after trying so hard to get out, we wear down, and we're too exhausted to focus on solutions or strategies at that point. However, when we learn to take captive our own thoughts or allow the Holy Spirit himself or through others to speak truth and life into us, it becomes an overflowing fountain of peace, overcoming that darkness and producing a light that cannot be hidden. And this is another reason why church membership, attendance, small groups, and discipleship are crucial. And then finally, this is for pastors and leaders. Do not forsake this responsibility of shepherding the flock. Now, it's not solely your responsibility to make sure everyone is healthy or to be producing content 24/7. However, make sure you're teaching and preaching biblical truth. That really fun sermon series about movies or whatever topic isn't important as taking your congregation's thoughts captive for the sake of truth and obedience. Yeah. Imagine what can happen when believers are soaked in truth and biblical thinking and understanding how to apply that truth in their domains and with their families and at their workplace, when they're doing great and when they are hurting. Pursue truth constantly and then let that flow out of you and trust the Lord to do his work.
We got a lot to talk about.
That's good, man. Part 2.
I have 10 questions in my head right now.
I've got 14.
Awesome. So we've got now 24 episodes. You impressed I could do that math? That's pretty good.
That's pretty fast.
That's
Silver
pretty good.
Creek for the win.
Yeah, baby. Hey, thanks for listening to Theology in the Dirt. Thanks for watching on YouTube, all the stuff. We appreciate it. Appreciate your feedback. theologyindirt@gmail.com. Send us questions. We'll be glad to get after it. Don't forget the website. Find all this stuff. Share it. Three Rivers. Appreciate you guys. All of our non-Three Rivers people. Appreciate you. Nathan, our special friend, age 31, love the art. Appreciate it. Y'all have a good one. See you next time.
See ya.
Out.
Fortunes of kings and queens.